guess I'll hand it over to Rob.
Cool. Right. Evening, folks. So this is a bit of an introduction to DXpeditioning. First of all, who am I? I'm Rob, licensed originally way back in '96, age not many. But then I kind of sat there and didn't do anything with my license for probably about the first 10 years. I did a little bit of RayNet and the occasional SOTA summits on the air activation almost accidentally. I ended up at the top of the hill with a handheld and put out a few CQs, but that was about it. Pretty much exclusively sort of 2 meters and 70 sems FM, local stuff, repeaters, that sort of thing. Then I guess back in 2008, I ended up at what was then called the RSGB HF convention in Milton Keynes. It's now the broader convention. And that was the point at which I effectively discovered amateur radio and everything else that the hobby could be. And since then, I've done a wide variety of different parts of the hobby and really settled on some combination of DXpeditioning, contesting, and SOTA summits on the air. And since then, I've operated from 31 different DXCC entities, so 90% of the list still to go, but that'll probably take a little bit longer. And to put this into context, this presentation I originally gave just before the start of the first lockdown back in February 2020, when we were allowed to get on planes and travel and all of that sort of thing. So I'm afraid that if you do get excited by this tonight, you're probably going to have to wait a few more months before you can actually put it into practice. But fingers crossed it will only be that, and we can get out to some interesting places again, maybe later this year or into next year. So before I talk about DXpeditioning, just a quick bit about DXing. And broadly speaking, that's working stuff that's far away or rare. And the definition of far away or rare varies depending on what you're doing. If you're on HF, then speaking to somebody in Germany is not particularly DX, that's not particularly far away, that's not particularly rare. On the other hand, if you were on 23 centimeters, then working that same person in Germany would be much more exciting. That would be a real challenge, possible, but definitely a challenge. Similarly, if you're working satellites, then or moon bounce, the distance is less interesting, but maybe a rare grid square, something that doesn't have any any resident amateurs, that sort of thing becomes DX. But broadly, it's a bit like bird watching. And this was an analogy that Martin G3ZAY used once, which is that if you get some humans and you give them a list of anything, they want to tick things off that list. So you can give them a list of species of bird, or you can give them a list of countries, or you can give them a list of islands, or you give them a list of pretty much everything, anything, types of train, routes of train, anything like that, and people want to collect them all. It's the Pokemon of the amateur radio world. And so people want to work all the countries in the world, and that's easy when it's Germany or England or Scotland or Wales or America. It gets much harder when you get further down that list. So, for example, going a bit further from here, Guernsey or Jersey, there's a lot fewer amateurs in those places than there are in England, and so it's rarer. Then you get to the really rare ones, which are literally a rock in the middle of the ocean. And so what's DXpeditioning about? It's giving people who want to tick those entities off, whatever they might be, the opportunity to make exciting contacts. It's allowing them to reach those sort of bottom of the list or top of the list, depending on which way you sort it, places, letting them get the achievement, but at the same time giving you an excuse to go there, an excuse to travel, an excuse to have some really exciting pile-ups and really exciting operating. So why are places rare? And I'm talking generally here in HF terms. So this is more countries and islands than it is grid squares or that sort of thing. So I'm mostly talking HF with a little bit of VHF. And generally it comes down to kind of one of these 5 things, which is either it takes a long time to get there, or it's difficult to get there for some reason, or once you get there, it's hard to get permission to play radio, or maybe it's hard to make those contacts. And that often depends on who you're trying to speak to. So somewhere that might be a very easy path to Japan might be a much harder path to North America or to Europe. Or it might be expensive, and that value of expensive has an enormous range. So if you take DXCC, which is sort of countries, these are entities, which is sort of countries plus some extra bits tacked on for administrative and geographical reasons. And if you sort that into a list according to how many people have claimed that they have worked that country, and then you put the ones that the fewest people have worked up at the top and the ones that the most people have worked down at the bottom, then right up at the top, you get North Korea, P5. And there is no amateur radio operation from North Korea, 99.999% of the time. And then you get to the places like Bouvet and Crozet Islands. And if you look at those on Google Earth, then you'll find that they are literally rocks in the middle of the Antarctic Ocean. And similarly, Scarborough Reef. Yeah, these places have no humans on them, let alone radio amateurs. At the other end of the list, you have Italy. And if any of you have been active on HF, you will have worked Italy. Pretty much guarantee that. Followed swiftly by the United States of America. Okay, that's a little bit trickier for us over in Europe, but there's a lot of amateurs in the US, and so they've all worked the US in the same way as we've all worked Italy. And Germany and European Russia. Yeah, these are the ones that have tens or hundreds of thousands of very active radio amateurs. So if you want to go somewhere that is rare, if you want to have these sort of exciting experiences, then you start at the top of the list and you work your way down until you find somewhere that you can go. And I don't know about you, but personally, my idea of fun radio operating does not involve having an assault rifle pointed at me, because that is the reality of operating in North Korea. A couple of people have done it, and they are literally sitting at their radio with the police or the army pointing guns at them the whole time. So let's cross that one off. Similarly, I'd love to go to Bouvet Island. I can't afford an icebreaker. That's actually what you need. If you come a little bit further down, you get to places like Midway Island. That involves hundreds of pages of paperwork and years of negotiation with the US Fishery and Wildlife Service. I've got other things to do with my time. So you sort of knock all these top ones off the list, and that's fine. And so you keep going down, and England's not right at the bottom, but we're pretty close. I can't remember where are we there. 332. So England is kind of about as boring as it gets as regards DXCCs. Turns out that doesn't always matter. But there is this sweet spot in the middle, and out of that 340 item list, somewhere in the kind of the 1 to 200 range, you get a lot of stuff that is much more accessible. Things like St. Martin, St. Vincent, Ascension. You can fly to these direct. Okay, you can't right now, but normally you could fly to these places direct on a regular commercial flight. Lots of African places if you like hot weather. I don't. But where do we start? And for the CamHams, which is the group that I've been very fortunate to be involved with, it all started in 2008. This was just before I got my full license. I had what was then my novice license. It's now the intermediate, my 2E1 call. And a few folks, 6 folks, decided they were going to go on holiday for a week. And they threw some radios in the car. Had a little bit of a play, went up to the Isle of Mull, which is part of the Inner Hebrides, just off the northwest coast of Scotland, or off the west coast of Scotland. And in that week, they did about 1,500 contacts. And that was pretty cool. They enjoyed themselves. They logged it all on paper, which made the QSL manager very sad afterwards. But thankfully learned from that for the next year. And that was a very relaxed thing. It wasn't a radio holiday. It was just a group of mates who went on holiday and happened to take some radios. but they enjoyed it enough that they sort of said, hang on, let's do this properly. And this was when I was lucky enough to meet them and indeed got invited along. And in 2009, we sort of sat down and said, actually, let's do this properly. Let's make this a week of radio rather than a holiday which happened to have some radio on the side. And in that week, we did 4,000 contacts. And then we went somewhere else the next year and 8,000, and the year after, and it was 12,000. And this is all Scotland. This is not high up that list of DXCCs. It's higher than England, but it's still very much down in that bottom third of the list. And we were making in excess of 10,000 contacts in a week. That's pretty good going. Now, IOTA, Islands on the Air, does add to the fun here. We're on islands off the coast of Scotland, and it turns out that when you get people who are really keen on DXing, they pretty quickly tick off the first 340 countries. They get bored, they want a different list to tick off, and so they look at islands, and it turns out there are more islands in the world than there are countries. And so you have about 2,500 groups of islands to work your way through. And so that keeps you busy for the next 40 years. But the basic strategy for us was find a holiday cottage. That's all it was. Find a holiday cottage, ideally as far away from everyone else as we could possibly make it, with a little bit of sort of ground around it, and a forgiving owner who didn't mind us rearranging the place. And we'd load up all the stuff into our cars and drive up there. There are good ferry links from the Scottish mainland out into pretty much all of the islands. And so you pretty much can take whatever you want, as long as you can fit it in the car, as long as you don't go over the sort of maximum weight. Managed that one year. Swift rearrangement, and you can go and play radio. Very easy, very cheap. We run these trips normally at a budget of about £250–300 per person for a week of holiday, including accommodation, food, travel, the lot. This doesn't have to be expensive. And what that gives you, as well as this sort of interesting IOTA, is the ability to play with antennas. Because I don't know about you folks, but my garden here is about 10 meters by 8 meters. I'm surrounded by houses. I'm in the typical sort of suburban location. I can put up some stuff. I've got a cobweb which works reasonably well on 20 meters up through 10 meters, and occasionally there's a 40-meter dipole just about gets squeezed in. But suddenly when you go to one of these places, you get to experiment with antennas. You get to leave the G5RV, which is a perfectly reasonable compromise when you're in a suburban garden. It gets you on a lot of bands very quickly, very easily. But it's not the best antenna in the world. Instead, you can put up resonant antennas on all the bands you're interested in working. You can put up a full-size top band dipole. You can put up a 20-meter high vertical for 80 meters. You can put up 3 and 4 element beams for the higher HF bands. Quarter wave verticals work amazingly, and they're incredibly lightweight. Fiberglass poles are the way forward for that sort of thing. Similarly on VHF, use the space. It's amazing how much you can do with it. And what that makes you realize is that the bands aren't dead. You do get people from time to time saying the bands are dead, no one's on, propagation's rubbish, and some of the time that's true, but most of the time that it's not. The bands aren't dead. Go on and call CQ, because somebody has to be the one that says that calls CQ. And if you can do that with a big signal and a low noise floor, suddenly the band isn't dead. And both parts of that are really important, because most of the folks, or many of the folks that you'll be speaking to back at home, will be in the 10-meter long garden with the antenna sort of bent into an interesting shape, and they will have all of the noise from next door's TVs and the VDSL and all of that lot. And so if you, as the DX station, if you can be really loud, you will get over their noise floor. So run the most power that you can under your license and with the equipment you can, with the equipment you have. Run 400 watts if you can. That means the people back at home will hear you, but also have a low noise floor at your end, because that means that their 10 watts to a very compromised antenna, you can hear them. And that's what enables the QSO. If you've got a high noise floor, there's no point being loud. Similarly, if you're not loud, people at home aren't going to hear you. And suddenly you can turn up on a band, tune around, hear no contacts happening at all, put out a few CQ calls, and suddenly you have a pile-up. And everyone's saying, well, you're the only signal on the band. It's only because you're the one calling CQ. And that's really how we got started. Next step on from that, and we still do these Scottish trips, by the way. 2020 didn't happen for obvious reasons, and frankly, 2021's looking a little bit dubious at the moment. But those are still great fun, and they are still the mainstay of the ChemHams activities. But there's also opportunities to go somewhere a bit rarer. And this is where we're talking commercial flights. Yeah, a plane ticket that you can book on British Airways website straight to a destination. And the first example of this was Bermuda, VP9. And it's pretty much as close to paradise as you can imagine. You know, if you ask someone to draw paradise, you'd pretty much get Bermuda. And it's even better than that as a radio amateur, because not only is it paradise as a tourist, it's also paradise as an amateur, because there is a renter shack. It's basically an apartment, as you would normally, you know, holiday apartment, couple of bedrooms, little kitchen, lounge area, except it comes with an antenna farm. And so all you have to do is to take a radio. Literally, you just get on the plane, shove your radio in your hand luggage, turn up, plug into the antennas that are already there. Ed, VP9GE Golf Echo, runs this place, and half the year he rents it out to regular tourists, and then half the year a bunch of radio amateurs turn up, and he's delighted either way. You're only allowed 100 watts under the island's license conditions. No one's allowed to run more than that. That means that you don't have to take linears. It does mean you can't be quite as loud as you might in the UK, but it turns out you don't need to, because Bermuda is just off the sort of east coast of America. Some people say it's in the Caribbean. It's not. It's way further north than that. It's sort of Massachusetts kind of latitude. And it has brilliant propagation, both to North America, it's just off the coast, and to Europe, it's just a hop over the Atlantic. And if you look in this top right picture here, this is where we're operating from the shack. You can see probably a 17-meter vertical dipole up there. And the ground just drops away to the coast. And then from there, you're straight across the Atlantic. It's a couple of hops, but it's over salt water the whole way. And that is just a recipe for fantastic propagation. And because you've got both of those continents, which are 2 out of the 3 main amateur populations in the world, you've basically got Europe, North America, and Japan are your biggest centers of activity for amateur radio. And 2 of those 3 you've got covered. Even with 100 watts, you can get some fantastic pile-ups. Doing something like this is also a really great opportunity to learn about propagation. If you sit in Bermuda on 30 meters and you just sit there all day, you can watch the propagation change. So you go on in the morning and you're working Japan, and then as the sun rises over Europe, then it moves to Asiatic Russia, and then to European Russia, and then to Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and then you'll get sort of Echo Alpha 8, the Canary Islands, the Azores. And then the east coast of America wakes up, and them and Canada, and then into West Coast America, and then carrying on into the evening around to VK and ZL, New Zealand and Australia. And you learn an enormous amount about propagation by just sitting on the radio solidly for as long as you can. And the skills that you build up from that are pretty amazing. Of course, the packing considerations are different when you're flying somewhere to when you're driving. The weight is everything. When you're driving up to Scotland, you can put a linear with a big heavy transformer in it. You can take a valve rig if you want. And as long as it fits in the car, you're pretty much good to go. As soon as you're getting on an aircraft, then suddenly you become much more conscious of weight restrictions. And there are some tricks. Fiberglass poles these sort of compact telescopic poles are brilliant. They're about 2 kilos each, and they'll fit in a normal airline suitcase. Similarly, you can do an awful lot with your hand luggage on a lot of sort of medium to long haul flights. British Airways have an allowance of 24 kilos of hand luggage. So you put all the heavy stuff in the hand luggage, and then the lighter stuff in your hold luggage, which is physically larger. The coax you use, you're constantly trading off the loss of the coax versus the weight of the coax, and a pretty good trade-off is this RG8 Mini. Yeah, it'd be lovely to use 213 or better, but realistically, you just can't carry that sort of weight unless you're doing a sort of shipping containers around the world, and ask T32C, and that's a bad idea. They tend to go missing. Another sort of similarly easy one, VP2M Montserrat. This is down in the Caribbean, and it sort of falls into that same class, which is that you can get there entirely commercially. You jump on it's a little bit more complex. You have to get on a plane to Antigua, and then you either take a small plane or a ferry over to Montserrat. But basically, it's all stuff that tourists will do pretty much week in, week out. Great propagation to North America, a bit harder to Europe, but it does come with a bonus. One of the rental properties on the island comes with a 60-foot tower and a 3-element Yagi for HF for 10, 15, 20 meters. And again, you just turn up with a radio, and the tower is also attached to the side of the house, which has a sort of rooftop veranda. So you don't even have to go up ladders or anything like that. You just get the aerial out and build it at kind of chest height, and then press the up button on the motor, and the tower winds itself up, which is brilliant. Does kind of get into the interesting area though, which is that if you want to go to Montserrat, for half of the island, you need a police escort. That's because there was a big volcanic eruption a few years back, and it's still very much ongoing. And we're not talking lava flows every day, but there's still a lot of volcanic activity. And so they effectively, Montserrat is the only country in the world which has a capital city with population 0. Effectively, the old capital was in the path of a lava flow and an ash flow, and they evacuated it to the top half of the island, which was previously uninhabited, and they still haven't been able to go back. And so if you do get a police escort, then you get to wander around the old capital, but at all times you have to stay within 30 seconds run of the car, so that if the volcano observatory sounds the alarm, you get out of there now. That's a very odd experience. So that's the sort of fairly easy to get to. What about the time consuming? And this one is ZD9, Tristan da Cunha. Don't know if any of you have heard of Tristan, but this is where it is. Zoom out a little bit. It's that one. Still not very helpful. Zoom out a bit more. It's that one. And this is South Africa down here, and Argentina. Yes, Argentina, get the right one, over here. And it's pretty much bang smack in the middle. Their claim is that they are the most remote inhabited island in the world. So how do you get there? Well, you fly to South Africa. Again, can't do that at the moment, sorry. And then you spend 10 days on a cargo ship. And it only takes about 18 months to get on the waiting list for that cargo ship, because they can only take 10 people at a time. Once you're on there, there's not a lot to do. Got no mobile phones as soon as you get about half an hour out of Cape Town, no internet. And so you pretty much find anything you can to pass the time. As a group of us, we sort of go outside a couple of times a day, get a GPS location, and then plot it on the nautical chart that someone had bought. And that gives you an idea of how slowly you're going. I think our record was something like 0.8 nautical mile an hour in the wrong direction when we had a day of particularly nasty storms. You also get used to watching how everything moves around on a boat, because this isn't like your sort of typical cruise liner where it's all stabilized. This thing just moves wherever it's going to move in the sea. And so very quickly at dinner time, you sort of get used to picking up the tomato ketchup and then putting it down and stacking stuff up around it so that it doesn't roll off the side of the table. Similarly, if you're a bloke, you very quickly get used to the idea that you're going to sit down to go to the toilet no matter what. You learn that on day one. Of course, eventually you get there and you have to get off the ship. And it turns out there's no sort of deep water harbour. Tristan is basically a volcano. It's very steep sided and there's very little flat land at all. And so this is their strategy, which is they chuck you in a box, attach you to the ship's crane, and drop you over the side. And there's a little sort of floating pontoon type thing that comes out to meet you. But this is the sort of typical setup for one of these expeditions. Interestingly, for this one, very, very glad I did take a linear, because down in the South Atlantic, no one's beaming that way on HF. There's no one down there. There's no point. And so you do need to be loud. Similarly, there was no Wi-Fi on the island, no mobile phone signals on the island, so you couldn't spot yourself on the cluster, and that made band changes very, very expensive in terms of time. I only had 4 days on the island, despite taking 10 days to get there and 10 days to get back, 4 days of actual operating. And so you'd go on a band, you'd call CQ with no answers, maybe for 5 or 10 minutes, and then the first person would find you randomly, and then they'd put you on the cluster, and then this would happen. Hopefully.
Thank you. Zulu Delta 9, Uniform Whiskey, up 5. The Echo Alpha 5 Hotel, Echo Alpha 5 Hotel 59.
Hotel Alpha 5, Hotel Yankee, Hotel Alpha 5, Hotel Yankee, over.
Roger, Hotel Alpha 5, Hotel Yankee 59.
Roger, 59,
73, Zulu Delta 9, Uniform Whiskey, up 5.
And that would go on for as many hours as you could bear to sit in front of the radio. Quite extraordinary. And because you only have such a short time, you just have to do your best to get as many people in the log as you can. You're never going to satisfy everyone. And operating strategy does become something you care about, because you've got people from all areas of the world, all with different propagation, and you have to say, okay, right, well, 20 meters is going to be to Asia, because that's the only way that you're going to work them. There's a volcano in the way on their short path. You have to work VKZL long path, and that means up at 5 in the morning to work them. Refuse to work Europe. Big signals from Europe, you can't work them. If you work Europe, you'll never hear the Australians. Then Australians go into darkness, that falls away, run Europe on 10 meters. Do that for the entire morning, early afternoon. Refuse to work America at that point. Into the early evening, then it's America on 15 meters. And the idea is you're trying to give everyone a shot at one band and get the country ticked off. There are people who would be delighted to work it on all bands, and people asking for 80 meters and what you have. You just have to try decide what your goals of that trip are going to be and meet them as best you can. Okay, back to the airport. That was the time consuming to get to. What about harder to get to? This time we're going to the Bahamas, and there's lots of islands in the Bahamas. There's the ones that, like Nassau, that everyone can go to. You just fly in there, not a problem. But there's also a bunch of islands that are uninhabited. And here it happens that it really helps if you have a friend who has a catamaran. This is John M0IDA on the right, Steve M1ACB who flew over with me on the left. And so we jump on John's cat and trundle off to Inaccessible Island. Similar kit, but different operating conditions. Here you basically set up on the beach, you operate, but it brings its own challenges, because you're fighting constantly against the wind, you're fighting against the salt, you're fighting against the lack of shelter, the ants that try to bite you. You can't sleep on the beach, so it's sort of back off to the boat every night. And the logistics get interesting. So John spends John's boat is actually sort of stationed in the US over our summer, and then he sails down to the Bahamas, and we joined him there. But it meant that the fuel for the generator we had to purchase 4 months before the start of the trip, and that meant we had to figure out how much petrol we needed. You can't just nip to the local BP if you run a bit short, and so that sort of led to a few days of setting up test rigs on the driveway and weighing the generator, and then operating for 2 hours and weighing the generator again, and then extrapolating that out to what that would take for a week's operating. Of course, there are always casualties. In the case of that trip, C6 APY, some combination of the generator and Steve and my linear didn't get on, and that acquired the broken by M1 ACB tape. These things happen. It's always a risk of these trips. Similarly, the real enemy on this one was salt. Yeah, we had our antennas. To say they were right next to the sea was an understatement. They were in the sea. The radial's literally in the water, which works amazingly well. It gives you fantastic performance. But you come to the end of the week and you rub your hand up the fiberglass pole, and you just get left with a handful of salt, and that corrodes everything. Absolutely trashes all the anything that isn't stainless steel screws in the radio. You have to disassemble the whole lot when you get home and clean it up. And so finally, for this bit, the difficult to get permission. This was January 2020, Zulu Charlie 4 Uniform Whiskey, which is the sovereign base areas on Cyprus. It took us 2 years to get the license to operate from there, and we were only able to do so because we were very fortunate to have a local contact on the island. It's bizarre because it's Cyprus. It's trivial to get to. You just fly in there, and the flights are dirt cheap. And even when you're on Cyprus, you can just drive into the sovereign base areas. So this is the British military administered areas of Cyprus, and you wouldn't even know you were in there. There's no borders, there's no checkpoints, there's not even any signs that tell you that you're in the sovereign base areas. But to get an amateur radio license to operate from the sovereign base areas is very tricky, and there's a lot of negotiation with the RAF in order to do so. And they won't issue licenses very often. Typically, you get an operation every few years. And so when you do that, you want to hit it hard. You want to give as many people the opportunity to tick that one off the list as they can. So whereas on many of the other trips we've done, you don't worry about taking a day's sightseeing tour around the island or that sort of thing, or going out and enjoying a dinner together. When you're the only ones that are going to have the opportunity to activate it this year, you just have to do the best that you possibly can. This was my luggage for the trip. It weighed nearly as much as I did, and everyone else did the same. So we probably had over half a ton of luggage that we took on the airlines for that. The timing was pretty much set. There's a beachfront cafe within the sovereign base areas that's open for 11 months of the year but closed in January. And we were very kindly allowed to operate from there by the owner. It was all closed up for the winter, so we had the run of the place. And it was freezing. If you think of Cyprus, you probably think of 30-degree summers. And for 10 months of the year, that's what it is. For the remaining 2 months, it absolutely is not. As a result, they don't have central heating. They don't have any heating, in fact. They don't have double glazing. And it is freezing. I have never done a radio trip where I've been so cold so much of the time as that trip. You can see Mike there, G7VJR, who's the guy who developed and runs Clublog. And he's in 3 layers of ski jackets, several of us were operating with sleeping bags wrapped around us, skiing trousers on, you name it. It was quite the thing. The thing that worked against us, interestingly, was the weather. We got there and Dom M0VFC said, "Oh, it's fine. There's no tides in the Mediterranean." He's right. And so we had this lovely beach, and we set up the antennas and set them back a sensible distance from the sea, and thought that's fine. The sea's not going to move. There's no tide, and indeed there isn't. But what there is instead is storms. And so what you carefully set up very safely and you think very securely becomes much less so against a storm in the Mediterranean. So the sort of meter-long lengths of rebar that we'd banged into the sand to hold the 18-meter poles just got thrown around. You could put paving slabs on top of them, and you'd find them tens of meters further up the beach. You nicely arrange all the radials around the bottom of your sort of quarter wave verticals, and then go back out there a few hours later, and all 16 of them are just bunched up in one direction where a wave's come up and taken the whole lot. So you're constantly fighting against that, constantly trying to recover your guy ropes and put them back into something. Somehow we only snapped, I think, 2 sections of pole in that week, but it was quite incredible. The video doesn't do it justice, but you can sort of see the effect that the wind's having on this stuff. And of course, you do try your best, but I love this combination of cluster comments. It's like, this is the anti-North America DXpedition. No North America. At the same time, why only North America? Okay, fine, whatever. Along similar lines, there was the people who loved FT8 and the people who hated FT8, and we sort of don't fall into either of those camps, really. We've got nothing against FT8 at all, but we decided not to for this trip, and that was really because what we'd seen a few times before was that we were seeing examples where there was lots of propagation. FT8 is an amazing weak signal mode, but we were seeing examples where there was a lot of propagation and nobody at all on SSB or CW, and a lot of automation of stations. And we thought, we're going somewhere that people are going to want to work. Let's just make people dig out those microphones, make them dust off the Morse keys, and try and encourage some activity on the other modes. And so we decided not to do FT8, and that made a lot of people happy, and it made a lot of people annoyed, and that's fine. If you don't like something, there's plenty else to play with as well. And so that's kind of the round trip of these things. So I should say none of this stuff is risk-free. If you're going to these places, you're potentially a long way from home. You're potentially a long way from medical assistance, and stuff can go wrong. And folks have sadly lost their lives on DXpedition. So you do need to consider that if you're thinking about one of these trips. You need to be aware of that. Of course, of all the hilarious and exciting ways that you could come to nearly dying, it turns out that actually it was the dodgy sausage roll on the services from up the M1 that did it for me. This was actually me being loaded into that. Thankfully all was well in the end, but genuinely you do need to be aware of the risks of this stuff. Just a very quick side note, I've not talked about the expensive ones. And when I say expensive, I don't mean like this is an expensive holiday expensive. I'm talking £1 million hire an icebreaker with a helicopter expensive. These are the ones right at the top of the table. This is the likes of Peter One Island. This is Bouvet Crozet, those sorts of things. Those sorts of trips can only happen with external support. Those are the ones where they'll be asking for donations. They'll be asking for £10 for a QSL card. And it's simply maths. If you divide the number of contacts that they make by the cost of the operation, you are talking tens of pounds per contact. And those folks need external support if you want them to happen. Yeah, if you're into DXing and you want to tick off those places, yeah, do make a donation. They're not making money out of it. But that is only true for that top few percent. Everything that I've talked about, what's that, 3B7C? Nice. Yeah, Rodriguez. Yeah, everything I've talked about tonight is absolutely doable within what people would consider to be a holiday budget. Some are more expensive than others, but we're talking in the sort of hundreds to maybe the most expensive trip I've done has been probably a couple of thousand. So it's in the sort of holiday range. It's not more expensive than a cruise or something like that. So maybe I've excited someone. How are you going to do this? Figure out how you're going to get there. Figure out how you're going to get a license. A lot of places have reciprocal licensing arrangements in place with the UK. Anywhere that's implemented SEPT, TR 6101, I think it is, you can, if you have a full UK license, you can just go and operate without having to do anything else. There's a bunch more places like Montserrat, like Bermuda, where having a UK license is enough to get you a license from the local licensing authority, but do leave plenty of time to do that. Decide what radios you're going to take. If you're going to be running more than one station, you do want clean radios, clean transmitters, good receivers. That means, you know, in the best case, the likes of the Elecraft K3s, K3Ss, the ICOM 7300s are amazingly good especially for the price. The 7610s even better. The Flexes, that sort of thing. You might need to add extra bandpass filters to stop the stations interfering with each other. Antenna-wise, on HF, you're really talking lightweight wire antennas. This is, you know, simple verticals, maybe simple beams, but really verticals are the way to do it. And some way of logging. If you're doing lots of QSOs, you don't want to be writing it down on paper, and you really want to be using a logger that is reliable and efficient. And that probably means a contest logger of some description, even if you're not doing a contest. And you probably want to be getting those QSOs up onto some kind of internet-based log management system pretty quickly. So whether that's Clublog or Logbook of the World, that sort of thing, so that people can check that they're in the log, especially if you're somewhere rare. And then there's the inevitable job when you get back home, QSLing. If you are working one of these DXpeditions, please use OQRS online QSL request. If you want a card, please use Logbook of the World. Please don't send your card to them unless they want it, because if they've just come back from somewhere and worked 20, 30,000 contacts, I'm sure your card is lovely, but it's just a waste of paper. They will not be looking through 20,000 cards. You know, if you want a card, they would be delighted. Anyone that goes on one of these trips would be delighted to send you one, but please just listen to their instructions, because it makes it so much more efficient. When you're working from a sort of a database of these are the people that have requested cards, you can get through it, you know, hundreds of cards very, very quickly. This was the ones from ZC4UW, and hopefully that'll confirm the contact. With that, any questions?
They've all gone quiet. I made a comment, which I realised later that you didn't say, that I recognise most in that room. Yeah, the photo with Peter.
Yeah, it's a few years old now, but
Dom.
That one.
Sorry, not Dom, mate. It was Gavin at the back.
Yeah, Gav there, Pete, 2M0SQL, Bob, G1SAA, Lawrence M0LCM.
I still refer to Pete as one of the best operators I know.
Yeah, he's good.
He's good. So. There was also a comment, okay, where do I sign up?
Well, hopefully that last slide hopefully is the indication. Yeah, that this doesn't need to be complicated and it doesn't need to be expensive. Start off with something simple like Scotland or Wales or Ireland or the Channel Isles. You know, you can get there quickly. If you go somewhere that's got some local amateurs in the local area, then when you blow something up, then yeah, they might be able to help out. We had that on at least one of the Scottish trips where we popped a capacitor in Bob's linear, and one of the local amateurs just drove down and said, "Oh, there you go, have that," dropped it in, and we were back on the air. So yeah, so start with something like that. You can still have an awful lot of fun, and it just gets you used to the style of operating, what works well, what doesn't work well, what you forget to put in the suitcase.
Even if you drive, just going somewhere within England would even work when we're allowed.
Yeah.
Just to get you away.
Yep, get you
out.
into that open space, room for antennas.
Yeah. So what if you do the exhibition? There's probably going to be some stuff that breaks.
Yep.
How do you make sure that what you're taking isn't overboard, because then it costs more, but isn't underboard that you find you don't have an ATU anymore?
No, it's a really good point. And it's something that depends a lot on how many of you are going. So if we do something like one of these Scottish trips with 12 of us on the trip, we're probably taking 8 stations. And if something breaks, then we're down to 7 stations, and that's cool. Like that's not a disaster. If you're on your own, then it's a lot harder to justify spares. When I did Norfolk Island, which is sort of halfway between Australia and New Zealand, there it was just me, and it was also part of a larger part of a sort of actually holiday in New Zealand. And the approach I took there was I took a KX3, Elecraft KX3, and a KX2 as the radios, both of them very small. The radios themselves were only 10 watts plus 1 linear. And the idea was that gave me 2 radios for not much weight and 1 amp. So the worst case was if any one thing broke, I still had, and at the worst case, I still had something. I still had 10 watts from one of the radios. In the more likely case, if it was radio that failed, then I could just use the other one. Similarly, yeah, when I did ZD9, I took the K3, which is the radio of choice, but also had a Yaesu FT450, which is much lighter, much cheaper, but gave me something. I could have got on air with that. It's a really tough one, especially if it's only 1 or 2 of you. As soon as you get up to more than 2 of you, then you naturally end up with spares, because you're running more than 1 station to start with, and so the worst is that you end up running fewer stations than you planned, but you're still on air at least.
It's a random question. Have you, when you're going places that are relatively accessible but just happen to be rarer, do you ever pick up bits of equipment in those countries, or order things to be there rather than carry them? And if so,
yes,
what?
Yeah. So again, this comes down to like local contacts are worth everything. When we did ZD9 Tristan, entirely randomly, Martin ZAY was on 20 meters, happened to speak to, just completely random QSO, happened to speak to Paul ZS1S, who's in Cape Town, and mentioned that this trip was happening. And Paul sort of jumped and said, "Oh, if you need me to pick up anything, then just let me know." And so we flew down to Cape Town, and Paul had bought, obviously we paid him for it, but he'd bought us coax, and he'd bought us wire, and we'd shipped some poles to him ahead of time, and that made that so much easier, because that the flight was the sort of luggage determining step. And similarly, when we did sovereign base areas on Cyprus, one of the local amateurs there had acquired all the rebar, lent us some reels of his coax for the week. These folks are yeah, you couldn't do it without them. It's brilliant. Obviously, it comes with risks, which is if you don't have a good contact that you trust, do you know that you're going to be able to get that kit? Do you know that it's going to make it there? And T32C, this is going back probably 10 years now, must be 10 years, was a big expedition, and they literally had a shipping container full of stuff. They loaded it up with 10 linears, 10 radios, tons and tons of kit, and it didn't make it. They got to the islands and it wasn't there. They knew it wasn't going to be there a week or two beforehand, and so they had to basically source an entire extra set of kit, 10 more radios, 10 more amps at the last minute, and pay an enormous amount in excess baggage fees. And the container, they got it back in the end, but it never made it to the island.
That's just a little daft follow-up. Anecdotally, you see lots of comments about carrying amateur radio equipment to other countries and people potentially trying to take the equipment. Ever happened or ever heard it happen in reality, or is it all anecdote?
I have had no problems. There, allow time to go through airport security. You will get stuff swabbed. You will get it through the X-ray another time. You will get questions. Be patient. Explain what it is, and it's fine. In all of my experience, and some things you learn are much more likely to draw attention than others. LiPo batteries are bound to get you questions, and just know what the policy is, and explain it, and it's fine. But it might take you another 20 minutes. If you put a CW paddle in your hand luggage, it looks like this solid block of metal on the X-ray with wires coming out, and of course that instantly is the cause for another inspection. Coming back from Gibraltar, we'd been operating down there for a couple of days, myself and Steve, and our hand luggage went through the scanners, got pulled over as it always did. They did the explosive swab. We were in sort of adjacent lanes. They put the swabs in the machines, and the machines went beep. And the people behind the machines looked a little bit concerned. And it turned out it was simple. It was just that when we'd been up the top of the rock, they'd cleaned out the operating shack with a load of bleach. And of course, bleach looks like a component you might use to make nasty things. But you just, if you're patient, if you leave plenty of time, it's generally fine. That said, this is true for all the places I've been. I'm aware that other folks have been to other countries where it is more common for brown envelopes to be exchanged in return for smooth passage. I have never experienced that.
I guess it really depends where you
I believe that it happens.
Yeah.
And I just add something to
Talking of kit that you're taking, what considerations do you make for the availability of power, given that the rest of the world doesn't have the wonderful power systems that we have in Europe?
Yeah, Montserrat, we had daily blackouts, and you cook dinner, you have a beer, you accept it. C6, the Bahamas, we had incredible generator problems. We'd borrowed a generator and obviously incredibly grateful to the folks that lent it to us, but it was a pain in the backside. It really was. You just make the most of what you've got, really. Obviously, do watch out if you're traveling outside of Europe for 110 volts versus 240 volts. Make sure you've got power supplies that deal with that range. Make sure that you switch them. Make sure you switch them back when you come home. Otherwise, the blue smoke tends to escape. Ended up with big post-it notes over the top of the amp saying, "Remember to set the voltage."
I was going to add something. When I've been to Guernsey, because we're on good terms with all the club over there, the most I've ever taken is a handheld radio. So you can do a DXpedition and literally not take anything.
Yeah,
if you know the right people. So
yeah, and there are lots of these renter shacks where certainly your antennas are ready for you. But yeah, in terms of taking kit, it's generally it's not too bad.
But your local knowledge bit is definitely worth its weight in gold.
Totally. And speak to folks that have done, if you're looking somewhere, speak to folks that have been there before, because every entity on the list has been activated, and normally anyone that's done it, you can see who's activated it in the past, and 99% of the time they will be delighted to offer advice. What worked for them.
Years ago, the Peter One Island you mentioned did a great talk at HFC.
Yeah, there's a good DVD of that as well.
Yeah, so that's worth looking into if you can.
Cool.
So if you know that certain radio amateurs work to a certain country, and you want to contact them and see if they have any information or if they've been working in a certain country, is just emailing them out of curiosity okay, or is that really frowned upon?
No, not at all. Not everyone might reply, and some people might not get around to it for a little while, but I would say look on qrz.com. If they've got their email address published on there, drop them an email. They're not under any obligation to reply. But if you send them a friendly note saying, hey, saw that you did this thing, really interested in that, have you got any advice? Many of them, I bet you would be very happy to help out.
And hopefully later in the year we might be able to start organising a community one.
Yeah,
that'd be nice if we just did a little field day between us, just as an opportunity for people to travel somewhere to play radio, and then
absolutely
see if something grows from it.
Yeah, find yourself a field, put some good aerials up. Use the space.
And whilst I've got Rob and Francis here, Rob mentioned about they do remote radio with their club.
Okay.
And he did have a recommendation, but it's not cheap.
Okay. Well,
what was the radio again?
Flex 6400.
Fair enough. That's like $2,000, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really good though.
I was thinking more like a Yaesu FT 950, is it? Something like that.
Yeah.
Something a bit cheap and cheerful. But yeah, that would be I think for now our headache is finding somewhere rather than a rig.
Yes. Yeah, that is
always going to be there.
Definitely a challenge. Somewhere that's got a nice low noise floor.
But obviously, if we do get closer to that option, you might find your tweets lighting up again.
Yeah, no, that's all good.
That was awesome. I wish I half wish there wasn't a flight thing, but I'll be honest, I wouldn't be going out tomorrow, but I have to do the expedition at some point just because it's go away and play radio.
It's great, and you learn so much. You have such fun, and so many of the contacts can be really great, and it's not the ones you think or you might think to start with. It's not the super stations that you work that are the great ones. It's we've gone to Scotland, and you spend a week and you work 10,000 people, but the ones you remember are the person who pops up on the last day saying, I've just got my foundation license. I've been listening all week. I've had to have a double scotch first to get myself the confidence to go on air. And you're my first contact. And that you remember. And when we went to Montserrat, one of my favorite contacts there was Colin. Oh gosh, I've forgotten his call sign. How outrageous. I'll find it in a second. But one of the Twitter guys had driven from his house to somewhere. He'd driven about 50 miles, put up a portable station right up on the top of the cliff in order to work us. It was just, and he was delighted because he'd just made contact with only running 5 watts. But he'd gone out and he was absolutely excited to get us in the log, and we were just as excited to work him and make that happen because it's those ones that really
Yeah, it's the odd ones or the rare one. My
BUU,
favorite,
M0VFC.
my favorite one when I was on Guernsey. I worked this German, but he was a stroke British call sign, so DL.
Yeah.
And he said, "Look, I'm trying to work you. I'm running 100 watts from Germany on a remote station, but I actually want to work you from my boat. I'm running 5 watts off the coast of Scotland.
Yeah.
Can you tell everybody else to be quiet so I can work you from my boat?" So I went, okay. I'll just figured out what his call sign was. Golf Mike stroke MM. Can you hear me now? And he went, Roger, Roger, got you.
Yeah.
He was absolutely over the moon because he could only run 5 watts from the boat. So
yeah, no, it is. It's brilliant.
But everybody else was just wiping him out. But once
to make those achievements happen, to delight someone back home is absolutely what it's all about.
And for him, it wasn't running 100 watts from Germany that was interesting. It was the 5 watts from his boat.
Totally.
Cool. Oh, that's really good. Oh, I hate it when I watch a talk and then when I have to do some stuff, but that was really cool. Thank you very much. It's definitely
very welcome.
Well, we would
if ever you do have any questions, any of you, emails on QRZ, you might need to poke me a couple of times if I don't get around to it the first time. But
and worst comes to worst, I think you've got another talk at some point, but we haven't booked a date for that.
I was going to say, depends how this one went, right?
Not too bad.
Excellent, loved it. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. Cheers, folks.
Before we end the recording, because I want to make sure this is on there, we've got a talk from Nathan's dad next week. I do forget his call sign, but he's Brian, and it's I think it's about SOTA, isn't it? But the details will go up on the notice board. So.